Okay, so after having talked about production, and that in the short run, that if we have one input that is variable, that the total production curve is going to be shaped kind of like a squiggly line in a little bit of a sense, right? That the variable input initially becomes more productive, and then becomes less productive, and then actually becomes destructive, if anything. What we need to talk about are the costs. And I can see I need a new marker here. And what we would say is that there are four major types of costs we want to talk about. And that would be the fixed cost, the variable cost, the total costs, and the marginal costs. Now, the fixed costs would be costs that do not change with the amount of the output. The variable costs would be the costs that do change with the amount of the output. The total cost would be the summation of these two. And then the marginal cost would be the change in the cost, the total cost, for changing the quantity. So or that the alternative would be that we could also just change the variable cost, and that would be seen as changing the quantity, right? Because the fixed cost wouldn't change as you change the quantity, right? Because the very definition of it is that it is always the same number. This is the only thing that changes as we change quantity, so therefore the only change in the total cost as we change the quantity would be changing the variable cost as we change the quantity. Now, if we look at how these are actually shaped, with Q being my output, dollars here, my fixed cost would actually be a horizontal line, right? Because it doesn't matter what the quantity is, the dollar amount is always the same. Now the variable cost. The question would be, how is the variable cost curve shaped? The total variable cost curve shaped? It starts at 0, but it's also shaped like a squiggly line. Very important. It's actually the opposite shape. It's the inverse of the production curve. We get this cost curve from the production curve. Remember, in the beginning of our production, my total product curve was going inward, right? That the slope was becoming steeper and steeper and steeper, which from a production standpoint means that adding just one additional worker at these kinds of stages, you get a whole bunch of output, which would mean from a cost standpoint, you only have to pay one worker, but you get a whole bunch of output, right? Which would mean that this is going to become flatter and flatter and flatter. As this is getting steeper and steeper and steeper, this is getting flatter and flatter and flatter. And then, as this gets flatter and flatter and flatter, this becomes steeper and steeper and steeper. So the total product curve is causing the shape for this total cost curve. It starts at 0, and now my total cost curve is just going to be a shift up of the variable cost curve by the amount of the fixed cost. So the fixed cost is the difference between these two. They are parallel to each other because the difference between them, the fixed cost, is never changing. Now, in this picture, we also need to talk about the marginal cost and how this is related to the average costs. So, in terms of dollars quantity, what we see is that for the marginal cost, it's actually J-shaped. J-shaped again, it's a transposition, or the opposing side of the marginal product curve. Right, so the cost per unit is actually falling in the beginning, right? That's where our workers are very, very productive, but then it starts rising. Now, we can talk about the ATC curve, or the average total cost curve, which would be the total cost over the total quantity, right? If we just divide those two, the average cost per unit. The way that mathematics works is that the marginal cost curve must always intersect the average cost curve at its minimum. Okay? So if that's happening, right, and this is U-shaped here, then we could also describe what's called the average variable cost curve, which would be my total variable cost over my quantity. Now, I'm not being sloppy here. These two curves are actually going to become closer to one another. My average variable cost, total variable cost over total quantity, these two curves are actually getting closer to one another. And why is that? Because the difference between them is the average fixed cost. Which is just my fixed cost over my quantity. But the fixed costs are falling. And they're always falling. It's always getting closer and closer to the x-axis, because the numerator is never changing, fixed costs, but the denominator, quantity, would be changing. So these two curves are actually getting closer and closer to one another, because the difference between them is this curve, which is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay, so in terms of these costs, the one thing to then kind of stress here is the fact that the cost curves, you're getting the cost curves from the product curves. So you need the product curves. The relationship between the product curves in the short run is motivating the shape of the cost curves in the short run. And that from a sort of a long-term perspective, what we could imagine here is that a firm having a whole bunch of options in terms of how big or how small to be. And that they could have three kind of scales of operations. So we could have short-run average total cost curve 1, short-run average total cost curve 2, short-run average total cost curve 3, and that a firm then has to make a decision of how big or how small to be. That we would have, in the long run, sort of a new function that kind of is enveloping the lower portion of all of those curves. That would be our long run average total cost curve. Okay. One of the things that is difficult to do by video, but which you're going to need to make sure that you do, is in looking at the typed notes, which I have in front of me, making sure that this is page 2, and the other one we have is on page 6. Make sure that you look at pages 2 and 6 of the typed up notes. These have the necessary calculations that you're going to have to do. I cannot stress it enough. It is going to be on the exam and or quiz, and you'll have it on the homework assignments as well. So you've been given plenty enough warning. Pages 2 and 6 of the notes are incredibly important. If you have a demand, for me to do that by video, let me know. And if I get enough responses that you want me to make a video about that, I'll be glad to do that. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here so that I can talk about the appendix to this chapter. So this is one appendix that you'll be responsible for here. So I'm going to stop the video here and pick it up with the last part in the next video.